June 6, 1944. British engineers rolled onto Normandy Beach with what looked like a joke. A tank that fired giant flying trash cans at 80 yards range, moving slower than a man could throw a rock. Within 6 hours, this crude contraption had annihilated 11 impregnable German machine gun bunkers that conventional tanks couldn't even scratch, saving hundreds of dying infantrymen in the process. But how did this ungainly weapon, designed in desperation and mocked by traditional armor officers, become the single most decisive piece of equipment on the deadliest beach of D-Day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1944, the British Isles hummed with the machinery of war. Every factory, every shipyard, every training ground worked day and night preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Nazi Germany had spent 4 years building massive concrete walls along the French coastline, turning every beach into a death trap of machine gun bunkers and artillery positions. British engineers knew that when their soldiers finally stormed those beaches, conventional weapons might not be enough. At a training ground in southern England, Lieutenant James Hartley stood in the cold morning air staring at the strangest piece of military equipment he had ever seen. Hartley was 26 years old, a tank commander from Manchester who had studied engineering before the war. He understood machines, understood physics, understood how things were supposed to work. What sat before him made no sense at all. The Churchill tank looked normal enough from behind. Its thick armor and wide tracks promised protection and mobility. But mounted on the front, where a proper tank gun should be, sat something that looked like a large metal pipe pointed almost straight up. The weapon, officially called the Petard spigot mortar, fired what engineers cheerfully called flying dustbins. These were 40-pound barrel-shaped bombs that launched into the air and fell onto their targets like medieval siege weapons. The entire contraption looked less like modern warfare and more like something from a museum. Sergeant Bill Morrison, Hartley's gunner, stood beside him chewing tobacco and squinting at the vehicle. Morrison was a working-class Scot who had served in tanks since 1940 and survived campaigns in North Africa. He trusted his eyes and his experience, and right now both told him this weapon was ridiculous. The dustbin rounds sat stacked nearby, each one looking too large and too clumsy to be effective. Morrison picked one up, grunted at the weight, and shook his head slowly. Major Geoffrey Thornton strode across the training ground with Captain Peter Walsh, the engineer officer responsible for converting regular Churchill tanks into these specialized vehicles. Thornton represented the old guard of British armor tactics. He believed in proper guns firing proper shells at proper ranges. Petard violated every principle he had learnt in 20 years of military service. Its range was barely 80 yards, meaning the tank had to drive almost within grenade-throwing distance of enemy positions. Its ammunition was slow, heavy, and awkward to load. The whole concept felt desperate. Walsh, however, had spent months working on the problem that kept him awake at night. German bunkers were built with reinforced concrete 3 feet thick. Regular tank shells, even the largest calibers, bounced off these fortifications like stones off castle walls. Artillery could sometimes crack them, but artillery could not advance with infantry across a beach. The question that haunted British planners was simple and terrifying. How do we protect our soldiers when they storm beaches defended by indestructible machine gun positions? The answer, Walsh explained to the skeptical officers, was not to penetrate the concrete, but to demolish it entirely. The Petard's 40-pound charge carried more explosive power than any conventional tank shell. When it hit a bunker, it would not pierce the wall, it would erase the wall. In testing, a single round had collapsed an entire concrete structure built to German specifications. The problem was that no one had yet tested it under real combat conditions, with bullets flying and men dying and chaos everywhere. Hartley climbed into the commander's position and examined the firing controls. Everything felt wrong. In a normal tank, you acquired targets at long range, fired precisely, and adjusted based on impact. The Petard required closing to point-blank range, launching this enormous projectile in an arc you could almost follow with your naked eye, and hoping it landed where you aimed. There was no elegance here, no sophistication, just brute force applied as directly as possible. The demonstration began with engineers placing a concrete test structure 400 yards down the range. It was a replica of German beach fortifications, complete with firing slits and reinforced walls. Thornton ordered a conventional Churchill tank to engage it first. The tank fired 3 rounds from 600 yards. All 3 shells hit the structure. All 3 bounced off, leaving only shallow scars in the concrete. The machine gun position inside would have remained fully operational, killing attackers by the dozens. Now it was Petard's turn. Hartley's crew drove forward, closing the distance slowly. 80 yards felt terrifyingly close. Morrison loaded one of the dustbin rounds with help from the loader, wrestling the awkward weight into position. Hartley gave the fire command. The weapon launched with a deep, hollow thump that shook the entire tank. The projectile arced through the air, tumbling slightly, moving so slowly that everyone on the range tracked its flight. The impact was beyond anything Hartley expected. The concrete structure did not crack or crumble. It exploded. Chunks of reinforced concrete flew 30 feet in every direction. When the smoke cleared, the bunker was simply gone. Where there had been 3 feet of Nazi engineering, there was now a crater and scattered rubble. Morrison whistled low and long. Thornton said nothing, but his expression changed from skepticism to something closer to shock. That night in the officers' mess, Hartley sat alone with his tea, thinking about what he had seen. The demonstration proved the Petard worked under controlled conditions. But beaches were not controlled. Beaches were chaos and terror and bullets coming from every direction. Could his crew really drive to within 80 yards of a German machine gun nest, load this massive round under fire, and hit accurately while men died around them? Could this ungainly weapon, this desperate innovation, really be the key to breaking Hitler's Atlantic Wall? He did not know the answer, but he would find out soon on the beaches of France. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ramp dropped at 6:30 in the morning on June 6th. Cold seawater rushed into the landing craft as Hartley's Churchill AVRE lurched forward into the surf. The sound hit him first. Machine gun fire cracked across the beach like 1,000 whips snapping at once. Explosions threw up columns of water and sand. Men screamed. Metal screeched against metal. This was Sword Beach, and it was nothing like the quiet training grounds back in England. The tank's tracks found solid ground, and the AVRE climbed out of the surf onto the sand. Through his periscope, Hartley saw bodies floating in the shallow water. He saw infantry huddled behind beach obstacles, trapped and unable to move forward. He saw other tanks brewing up after hitting mines, black smoke pouring from their hatches. And directly ahead, set into a concrete structure barely visible against the morning gloom, he saw the muzzle flash of a German MG-42 machine gun cutting down British soldiers as they tried to advance. The bunker sat 200 yards inland, positioned perfectly to sweep the entire beach approach. Its firing slit was a narrow black rectangle in 3 feet of reinforced concrete. Conventional Churchill tanks were already engaging it, their shells hitting the structure and bouncing away like pebbles thrown at a brick wall. The German gun never stopped firing. Every few seconds another British soldier fell. The infantry could not advance. They could only die or hide. and hiding on an open beach only delayed the inevitable. Morrison's voice came through the intercom, tight with tension. The loader had already wrestled one of the 40-pound dustbin rounds into position. Hartley ordered the driver forward. The AVRE rolled across the sand toward the bunker, closing the distance that meant everything. 150 yards, 120 yards. The machine gun shifted its fire toward the approaching tank. Bullets pinged off the armor like angry hornets. 100 yards, 80 yards. Everything Hartley had learned in training compressed into this single moment. The bunker filled his vision through the periscope. He could see the concrete texture, see the darkness of the firing slit, almost see the German soldiers inside feeding belts of ammunition into their weapon. The distance felt impossibly close. At this range, if the Petard failed, if the round missed, his tank would sit exposed while the Germans called for anti-tank support. There would be no second chance. He gave the fire command. The Petard launched with that distinctive hollow thump that made the entire tank shudder. The dustbin round arced up and forward, tumbling slightly as it flew. Time seemed to stretch. Hartley watched the projectile's lazy flight, watched it curve down toward the bunker, watched it strike directly against the firing slit. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the entire concrete structure erupted outward. The explosion was massive. The 3-foot-thick walls did not crack or chip, they disintegrated. Chunks of concrete the size of bathtubs flew through the air. Steel reinforcement bars twisted like wire. The entire bunker collapsed inward on itself, crushing everything inside. When the dust settled, the machine gun was silent. The position that had killed dozens of British soldiers in the past hour was simply gone. Rubble and crater marked where German engineering had stood moments before. Morrison let out a breath he had been holding since they loaded the round. The loader was already wrestling another dustbin into position without being asked. Through his periscope, Hartley saw British infantry rising from cover and moving forward past the destroyed bunker. They were alive because of what his crew had just done. But there was no time to think about that, because another machine gun opened fire from a second bunker 400 yards up the beach. The pattern repeated. Drive forward through the chaos, close to 80 yards while bullets hammered the armor. Fire the Petard. Watch the enormous round arc through the air. See the bunker explode into rubble. Move to the next target. By mid-morning, Hartley's crew had destroyed 5 German positions. Each strike was similar. Each proved what the training exercises had suggested. The Petard was not elegant or sophisticated. It was brutally, perfectly effective at one specific job. The 6th bunker was different. It sat on higher ground with a better angle of fire, and the Germans inside had watched what happened to their comrades. They concentrated their fire on Hartley's approaching tank, trying to hit vision blocks and track wheels. The tank shuddered as heavy-caliber rounds struck the front armor. The driver called out damage to the left track. Morrison loaded the round with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. 75 yards, 60 yards. Hartley fired. The round struck low, hitting the concrete foundation instead of the firing slit. But 40 pounds of high explosive does not care about precision. The entire bunker lifted slightly, then collapsed sideways as its foundation crumbled. The machine gun tumbled out through the broken wall, followed by dust and debris. Another German position eliminated. Another group of British soldiers able to move forward instead of dying on the beach. By noon, Hartley had lost count of how many bunkers his crew had destroyed. 8, maybe 9. Each one had seemed impossible to approach in training. Each one had fallen to a single Petard round. The weapon he had thought looked like a joke back in England had become the most important piece of equipment on this beach. Not because it was powerful, though it was. Not because it was accurate, though it proved accurate enough. But because it did exactly what needed doing when men were dying and conventional weapons failed. The ungainly dustbin mortar, the crude pipe launcher, the flying trash can. It demolished fortifications that regular tanks could not touch. It saved infantry lives by the hundreds. As the sun climbed higher over Normandy, Hartley began to understand something profound. War was not won by the most elegant weapon or the most sophisticated design. It was won by the right tool, applied at the right moment, no matter how crude that tool appeared. By late afternoon on June 6th, Hartley's AVRE had destroyed 11 German bunkers. His crew moved with mechanical efficiency now, each man knowing his role without need for commands. Load the dustbin round. Close to 80 yards. Fire! Watch the concrete explode. Move to the next target. The beach behind them was littered with rubble that hours before had been impregnable fortifications. British infantry advanced inland in groups that would have been cut down that morning. The invasion was succeeding, and the Petard mortar was a crucial reason why. Hartley climbed out of his tank as engineers waved them back for resupply. His legs shook when his boots hit the sand. He had been inside the AVRE for 12 straight hours, breathing cordite fumes and oil smoke, listening to bullets ping off armour, watching bunkers disintegrate through his periscope. Now, standing in the open air with the sound of distant artillery rumbling, everything felt strangely quiet. Morrison joined him, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. Neither man spoke for a long moment. There were no words for what they had just experienced. A young infantry captain approached him, his uniform still wet from the landing. He looked at the AVRE with something close to reverence. His platoon had been pinned down for 3 hours by a machine gun nest until Hartley's tank eliminated it with a single petard round. 28 men in that platoon survived because of what this crude weapon accomplished. The captain tried to thank Hartley, but could not finish his sentence. He just nodded, shook their hands, and walked away. Morrison took a long drag on his cigarette and stared at the sea. That evening, after the crew had eaten cold rations and checked the tank for damage, Hartley sat on an ammunition crate and pulled out the small journal he carried. His hands were still shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. He began to write, trying to capture thoughts that felt too large for words. "Yesterday," he wrote, "I thought Petard was a mad scientist's joke. A crude pipe launcher that belonged in a museum, not on a modern battlefield. I was embarrassed to command such an ungainly vehicle. Today, I understand it is the most important weapon on this beach." He paused, thinking about the 11 bunkers his crew had destroyed. Not damaged, not suppressed, destroyed. Erased from existence by 40 pounds of high explosive delivered at point-blank range. The Germans had built those fortifications using their best engineering principles, designing them to withstand any conventional attack. They had poured concrete 3 feet thick, reinforced it with steel, and positioned the firing slits for maximum coverage. Their bunkers were architectural achievements, perfectly designed to kill anyone who approached the beach. And every single one fell to a weapon that looked like something cobbled together in a desperate rush. Because that was exactly what it was. British engineers had looked at an impossible problem and designed the simplest possible solution. Not the most elegant solution, not the most sophisticated. Just a massive explosive charge launched at close range to demolish rather than penetrate. The Petard succeeded precisely because it did not try to be clever. It was pure brute force applied with absolute focus on a single task. Hartley wrote about the moment that changed his understanding. It was the 6th bunker, the one on higher ground, that concentrated fire on his tank. He had been terrified closing that distance, certain they would be hit, knowing that if the Petard failed, they would die. but the round struck true and the bunker collapsed and his crew survived. In that moment, watching 3 feet of German concrete crumble into dust, he realized something fundamental about warfare. The best weapon is not the one that looks impressive. It is the one that solves the problem when soldiers are dying. Morrison appeared beside him as darkness fell over the beach. The sergeant sat down heavily, his face showing every one of his 38 years. He had been in tanks longer than Hartley had been in the army. He had seen weapons come and go, had watched clever designs fail under combat stress, had learned to trust only what worked when bullets were flying. He looked at the AVRE sitting nearby, its ugly petard mortar pointing at the sky, and he said something that Hartley would remember for the rest of his life. "It is not about the biggest gun, sir. It is about the right gun." That simple observation captured everything. The Germans had big guns, they had powerful guns, they had guns that could kill from miles away. But on this beach, on this day, none of those mattered. What mattered was a stubby mortar that fired dustbins at 80 yards and turned concrete into rubble. What mattered was that British engineers had looked at a specific problem and designed a specific solution, however crude it appeared. Practical innovation had defeated elegant convention in the most dramatic way possible. Hartley continued writing as the last light faded. He wrote about the infantry captain who could not find words to thank them. He wrote about watching British soldiers advance past destroyed bunkers, alive because his crew had eliminated the machine guns that would have killed them. He wrote about the terror of closing to 80 yards and the relief when the petard struck true. Most of all, he wrote about understanding that war is ultimately about solving problems, and the best solutions are often the simplest ones applied with absolute commitment. The AVRE had looked ridiculous in training. Its weapons seemed absurd compared to sleek tank guns. But today, it has saved hundreds of lives by doing one job perfectly. Hartley closed his journal and looked at the stars beginning to appear over Normandy. Tomorrow, they would advance inland, and there would be more bunkers to destroy, more problems to solve. He felt ready now in a way he had not been that morning. He understood his weapon, understood its purpose, understood that crude effectiveness would always beat elegant inadequacy when men were dying. Petard had taught him the most important lesson of his military career, written in exploding concrete and saved lives across a blood-soaked beach. The war did not end on the beaches of Normandy. Hartley's AVRE rolled forward through France and into Belgium, then crossed into Germany itself. At every fortified position, the pattern repeated. German engineers built impressive defenses using their finest concrete and steel. British engineers destroyed them with the crude petard mortar that everyone had once thought looked like a joke. The port city of Le Havre fell after AVREs demolished its coastal fortifications. The island of Walcheren opened to Allied shipping when petard rounds collapsed bunker after bunker. At the Rhine River, German positions that commanded the crossing points disintegrated under the flying dustbins that tumbled through the air like medieval siege weapons. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Hartley had lost count of how many concrete structures his crew had destroyed. Dozens, certainly, perhaps more than 100. Each one proved the same lesson that D-Day had taught him. Specialized tools solve specific problems better than general-purpose weapons ever could. The petard was never going to win tank battles or destroy enemy armor. It did not need to. It did one job perfectly, and that job needed doing throughout the entire campaign from Normandy to the heart of Germany. Hartley returned to Britain in July 1945 with Morrison and the rest of his crew. They traveled by ship across the Channel, reversing the journey they had made on June 6th. The difference was profound. Then they had crossed toward an uncertain battle aboard a crude weapon they did not fully trust. Now they crossed as veterans who understood that the ungainly AVRE had been exactly what the war required. Hartley carried with him a wooden box containing photographs of destroyed German bunkers, technical notes on improved petard tactics, and the journal he had kept throughout the campaign. England looked smaller somehow after everything he had seen. The training grounds where he had first questioned the petard's design seemed quaint now, peaceful in a way that felt almost unreal. Hartley was invited to speak at the Royal Engineers headquarters about his experiences. He stood before officers who had never left Britain, men who still thought of warfare in traditional terms, and tried to explain what he had learnt in the concrete dust of demolished fortifications. He told them about the first bunker on Sword Beach, how it had seemed indestructible until 40 pounds of high explosive erased it from existence. He described closing to 80 yards time after time, feeling terror each approach, watching the dustbin rounds arc through the air, seeing German engineering crumble into rubble. He explained that the petard looked crude because it was crude, and that crudeness was its greatest strength. It did not try to be sophisticated. It did not pretend to be elegant. It was a pure function expressed in the simplest possible form. Some officers nodded with understanding. Others still looked skeptical, as Hartley himself had been before D-Day. He realized you could not truly explain combat to someone who had never experienced it. You could not make them understand the relief of watching a machine gun position collapse, knowing that weapon would kill no more of your countrymen. You could describe it, but the visceral truth of it lived only in memory and in the hands that still sometimes shake when loud noises echoed unexpectedly. Hartley took a position with the post-war tank development program. Britain was already thinking about the next war, the next generation of armored vehicles. He advocated strongly for maintaining specialized engineering tanks rather than trying to make one vehicle do everything. The AVRE concept, he argued, should be preserved and improved. Future wars would need ways to break through fortifications, clear obstacles, and support infantry. The petard might become obsolete, but the principle it represented must continue. He thought often about Morrison's observation on D-Day. It is not about the biggest gun, it is about the right gun. That simple truth applied to more than just weapons. It applied to how nations thought about problems, how they designed solutions, how they balanced sophistication against practicality. The Germans had built beautiful fortifications using complex engineering. The British had built an ugly weapon using straightforward thinking. The ugly weapon had won. 20 years later, in 1965, Hartley stood before a new generation of Royal Engineers officers and told them about the petard. He was 46 now, graying at the temples, carrying the weight of 2 decades since the war. The young officers listened politely to an old veteran talking about obsolete weapons. But Hartley was not really talking about the petard. He was talking about how to think. He told them that elegance means nothing under fire, that only results matter when soldiers are dying. He explained that the petard mortar was crude and short-ranged and awkward to load, and also the single most effective weapon on Sword Beach that morning. He described how it turned impregnable defenses into rubble with one strike, how it saved hundreds of infantry lives, how it proved that practical innovation defeats elegant convention every single time. The Germans, he said, had built their fortifications using the finest engineering principles. We built a weapon using pragmatic British resourcefulness. Our weapons destroyed their fortifications because we focused on solving the problem rather than impressing anyone with our sophistication. That was the legacy of the petard, and that was the lesson every engineer should carry forward. The best weapon is not the one that looks impressive in a parade. It is the one that solves the problem when men are dying. Hartley kept one photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. It showed a destroyed German bunker on Sword Beach, collapsed into rubble by a single petard round. Whenever young engineers asked him about his war service, he showed them that photograph. He explained that the weapon which destroyed that bunker looked like a trash can launcher, that conventional officers had mocked it, that he himself had doubted it, and then he told them how it had saved his life 11 times in one day by doing one simple job perfectly. The men who designed the petard never won awards for elegant engineering, but they won the war on the beaches, one demolished bunker at a time. That was what mattered. That would always matter. Simple, crude, effective solutions applied when they were needed most. The right tool for the job, however ungainly it appeared, will always beat the wrong tool, no matter how impressive it looked. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.